Hello and welcome. I'm Katrina, a librarian here at Sno-Isle Libraries. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program, Sea Serpents, Lake Monsters, and the Search for Hidden Animals with David George Gordon. Before we get started, I have a few pieces of housekeeping info to share. Your cameras and microphones are turned off and will remain so throughout the program. Please put your questions and comments into the chat window. We will have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the program, and overall we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Sno-Isle Library's YouTube page in a few days. David George Gordon is the award-winning author of the Eat a Bug Cookbook, Heaven on the Half Shell, the Sasquatch Seeker's Field Manual, and 18 other titles. An experienced naturalist and skilled public speaker, he shares his enthusiasm for nature through a range of interactive venues. He studied aquatic biology in college and worked at a museum and 2 public aquariums. He lives in Seattle. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. This is just great. And for those of you who walked in on this beautiful painting, this is the creature that I'm going to talk a little bit about today called Cadborosaurus. And this is like our local answer to the Loch Ness Monster. This is something that people see often, believe it or not, in the Strait of Juan de Fuca between Canada and the United States. So off the coast of Vancouver Island, people have had sightings of this beast. No one really knows what it is at this point. And the best way of referring to this, I think sea monsters is a little inaccurate because they're monstrous if we don't know what they are. But in actuality, I think the more polite term would be water beings. So that's what I've started using recently. Furthermore, sea monster means they're in the ocean, and actually some part of my program is about lake monsters or lake beings. Let's just say water beings. And I'll talk about cryptozoology for those of you who like to have a big word to throw around at the next Scrabble game you're in. That's the one. So let's get started here. I want to start out by showing you a picture of me in Chicago, Illinois, where I was raised as a little kid a long time ago. And you know, I was even back then, and I'm probably about 4 years old in this picture, I was an amateur naturalist. I spent a lot of my time in the backyard, which is where most of the nature was in my part of North Chicago, and in the public parks. And I just loved being outdoors and seeing all of the fascinating stuff that you could just see within easy reach of your back door. Here's me as an older guy. And yes, if you're looking closely, I'm holding a banana slug in my hand. And I've stayed an amateur naturalist for most of my life. I have worked at public aquariums, and then more recently with a group called the Washington Sea Grant. It's a program at the University of Washington. I was their science writer for 15 years. So I love science and I love the outdoors. So that's where this talk is going to come in handy. I've written a bunch of books, including this one, Secret World of Slugs and Snails, which I came to pose with that beautiful banana slug in my hand. And this book is unfortunately no longer in print, but if you can find a used copy, I bet, especially if you're a gardener, you'll learn a lot about these creatures. This is the one that really kind of made me a household word that was in big air quotes there, a household word in the world of cooking with edible insects. It's called the Eat a Bug Cookbook. And this edition is actually a newer edition. The book was in print for about 20 years. It now has, at that point, had 40 ways to cook everything from little tiny termites and ants all the way up to big tarantula spiders. That's kind of a topic unto itself. And sometime maybe I'll be back to give you a little lowdown on that. It's an interesting topic. But I would say most recently I wrote this book, The Sasquatch Seeker's Field Manual. And this is a scientific approach to what I call jokingly people who say I seen him, but they can't really tell you much more than that. And I really want people to collect information that will be helpful to scientists and that scientists will get excited about. So a lot of this book is actually about, well, using citizen science to uncover North America's most elusive creature is the subtitle for that. And it's about how to get, if you actually did see or hear or smell something that reminded you of something like a Sasquatch, this will actually help you figure out how to document this so it'll be added to our wealth of, or in this case, dearth of information about Sasquatch. Okay, it inspired me to get into this next topic. Well, here's a good picture of Sasquatch for those of you, the three of you who don't know what one would look like. And this is actually from a film called Harry and the Hendersons. I highly recommend it. It's an enjoyable movie and it's set in Seattle. So way back when this movie was made, it was a land of flannel shirts. Well, here I am wearing one. Okay, but what I really want to roll the time, the calendar back to the 1700s. And this is a nice picture of Carl Linnaeus. He is a Swedish naturalist in the early 1700s. He posted what is now still being used as the way that we describe nature, animals, and plants, and during his day, rocks as well. But using this, what's called this binomial method or scientific method of having two names for a creature. So a genus name starts out and a species name. And we know a lot of these names, whether you think about it or not, because that was a system that worked. It hasn't been changed dramatically, although the idea of actually naming rocks that way was dropped out later. But his 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 branch was called the Systema Natura, and it was basically the scientific method for describing creatures. Okay, now during his time, uh, Linnaeus had a bunch of creatures that counted as puzzles for him. Couldn't really say what they were related to, or couldn't give them a valid scientific name, a genus and species name. And his name for that, in the Linnaean classification system, was this Animalia paradoxia. I love that term. Try that one sometime. It basically means unknown animals. Much, much, much later in the 1950s, people started talking about these creatures as what we now know as cryptozoology, or the creatures themselves would be called cryptids. And basically, that cryptozoology means the science of hidden animals. Now, in the 1950s, that topic was suddenly brought to life in the form of a couple of books by Bernard Heuvelmans. He was a Belgian scientist. His writing was translated into English, and he had two books. One was called On the Track of Unknown Animals, and his later title was called The Wake of the Sea Serpents. And that's the one I'm going to talk about today, and his whole arrangement of classification for those cryptozoology creatures, the cryptids. So I'm following his pattern, which has remained pretty much the same. People may or may not agree with his classifications, but it's the best one we got. So bear with me while I walk through how he divided up the wonderful world of cryptids. Here's Bernard Heuvelmans. He had a lot of eccentricities. One of them was he collected pet primates. So this is him holding, I believe, a chimpanzee, an adult chimpanzee that was his pet. He had all sorts of stories, and someday someone will write a book about him. Maybe not me, but someone can expose what a smart and unusual person he was. Um, in the world of cryptozoology, um, he had co-founded an organization called the International Society of Cryptozoology, and he had a newsletter that was published. As you can see, it wasn't all about big, scary animals. Like this one has a cover story about the world's largest gecko that was discovered, unusual. And people are still discovering lots of animals today. So things that we didn't know existed, well, that's just part of the discovery period here. Okay, so the first classificatory scheme involves creatures that in Heuvelmann's view were unconfirmed. These are animals whose existence was alleged but not demonstrated. And the one that comes to mind immediately for me is this one, the unicorn. Now, there's lots of stories, and nowadays, T-shirts and you name it, balloons, all sorts of artwork about unicorns, but there's no physical evidence that these ever existed. In fact, the story goes that the early Vikings used to sell unicorn horns to wealthy nobles that they would encounter. They're supposedly great medicine for warding off all sorts of diseases, giving you a long life and a magical one at that. But it turns out what the Vikings were actually selling were horns from this thing. It's actually a tusk from this thing, a narwhal, aquatic creature, marine mammal that lived in the ocean and was certainly known and hunted by the Vikings. And they would, gee, that horn looks just like a unicorn, doesn't it? They would take the horns and try to sell them. So it was a scam, basically. But people still like to think of this as a possible creature. Another category disputed that I'm taking this from Hovelmann's discussion here. The body of evidence does not support the animal's existence. What could that be? Well, this is my favorite example of that. This is a picture that I actually cribbed off of the internet, and it's purportedly showing a giant snake, really big. If you imagine that those are all trees on either side of the river, that this thing supposedly was taken. Well, I don't know if this is a good picture or not to believe, but it's fascinating. And you know, this is one of the biggest snakes ever seen in reality. This one is from a zoo in Texas. I think it's still alive. It's 25 feet long. So a far cry from what you just saw in that first picture. I want to tell you there's actually been a reward offered by the Bronx Zoo in New York for anyone who can deliver in good condition a snake exceeding 30 feet in length. For that, you could get something like a prize of $50,000. So before you quit your day job and go after this creature, I should say that this reward was put out during the time of Teddy Roosevelt. So the early 1900s, he put it out as a dare. It was people, he was a great outdoorsman, and people were always telling stories. And he was like, there's no evidence for this. And he was right. This reward has remained unclaimed for something like 100 and some years. So, oh well. It's a fascinating idea, but we haven't found that creature yet. I don't believe the Bronx Zoo offers this reward now because they've kind of had a little bout of conscience about offering a reward for capturing and maybe even killing by accident a live snake. So not something you can get right now, but still something to aspire to, is to prove that there are creatures of this size and maybe open the door for that one photo I showed to get this started. Okay, these are creatures where evidence has been put forth, but has not been accepted by the scientific community. And that's really was the main theme of my Sasquatch Seekers Field Manual, to get better evidence so that scientific community can get behind that this might or might not exist. There he is. Now, I talk about this famous film footage in my book. This is taken in the 1960s by two guys who were out searching for Bigfoot in Bluff Creek. Bigfoot and Sasquatch, by the way, are two names for the same creature. They supposedly were out hiking on horseback, actually, in Bluff Creek, and they rounded a bend and stumbled across this creature that was sitting on a riverbank enjoying the sun, maybe basking. Saw these people on horseback. The horses freaked when they saw this creature. And here, this is a photograph, or actually film strip, that was taken, I think, about 20 seconds worth of film of this thing hightailing its way out. Now, the ironic part is a lot of scientists have looked at this film footage, and they are all in agreement that whatever it is has not been disproved by this picture. In fact, they say if it was a fake, it must have been a good one for its time, 1960s. And no one at this point has been able to spot a zipper in the suit if it's really just a guy in a suit. We don't know. If you think about the state of the art at that time, we're talking about Planet of the Apes. Definitely those movies looked like people in suits. Nowadays, the more recent Planet of the Apes movies are a lot more convincing thanks to all the computer generated special effects that they have. But at the time, to create something that was this convincing was hard to pull off. I will say, as I point out in my book, there's lots of things that are wrong with this picture. For one thing, no one really knows who developed the film. Supposedly, it was taken on a Saturday, rushed to Spokane, developed on a Sunday, and shown at a press conference in Seattle on Monday. Well, right off the bat, one wonders who was around working to do even an emergency job in the 1960s at a photo lab on a Sunday. So we're wondering about that. There's also no leader or any outtakes or anything that was not this 20 seconds worth of film that has survived for us to use it in comparison. If we had that early leader, you know, that thing when you watch a film and it goes, if you're watching a home movie, it starts with a kind of a countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And in there's a whole series of numbers that flashes by. That's the time it was developed, the date it was developed, and where it was developed. We don't have that. So a lot of scientists do not want to get into this topic. They feel like it's going to damage their reputations, and they kind of tend to look the other way. And when asked about it, it's unfortunate because they're the ones who could solve this mystery. Okay, here's an interesting category in itself. These are confirmed cryptids, animals that were formerly classified as cryptids, but whose existence has since been established. Now, not just that giant gecko we saw on the cover of the International Society of Cryptozoology newsletter, but some stuff that we now know, oh, of course it exists. And I'm thinking in particular, this is one that they've actually used as the mascot for that ISC newsletter. It's called an okapi. Maybe you've seen these in a zoo, but until the late 1800s, early 1900s, no one knew whether these creatures actually existed. Natives from the Congo who lived in the center of Africa certainly were familiar with this creature. It was about the size of a horse. It's actually related, they now know, to a giraffe, but lived in these very thick forests, very hard to find. And it wasn't until an explorer actually shot one of these and shipped the body back to England, where they studied it in the Royal British Museum and determined, yes, this creature does exist. It's not just something that was being bandied about as legend by the natives of the Congo. Another one that's equally amazing. You all know this one. I had a little stuffed version of this as a child. It's a giant panda, but it wasn't until the mid 1800s that anyone actually saw one of these alive outside of China. The first one was discovered in the 1860s by a missionary who saw one that had been killed by hunters. And then much later, about 50 years later, there was an explorer, a French explorer, I believe, who actually purchased a cub of one of these and brought it back to Europe to show it off. So definitely it went from being a cryptid, I don't believe it, to a, yep, that's it. Now everyone knows pandas. They're pretty popular. And if you've ever watched Kung Fu Panda, you know that they have all sorts of skills. Well, at least in the movies. Okay, this is a really fascinating one for me. These are extinct creatures, animals that are generally believed to be extinct, but may in fact still exist as relic populations. Some people would say the Sasquatch or Bigfoot is one of those, that it didn't go extinct as they might have thought it would. It actually crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America from Siberia. That's the theory at any rate. And, that hasn't been proven at this point, but lots of creatures that we once thought were extinct have certainly been around, just have eluded us. And that could include birds, it could include plants, it could include animals. A lot of people think of the Loch Ness Monster as one of those creatures. When people have reportedly seen it, it looks a lot like what is known as a plesiosaur. This is an aquatic, well, not exactly a dinosaur, but an aquatic reptile that has been extinct for millions and millions of years. But most of the drawings that you see of the Loch Ness Monster, or Nessie as it's commonly called, looks a lot like the plesiosaur. So did it exist? Well, we'll find out someday, we hope. I love this. There were all sorts of amazing creatures. This is actually the skeleton that's in the Carnegie Museum. No, excuse me, the Yale University Museum in on their campus. And this is actually an archelion, which means a very ancient turtle. It was a sea turtle that lived long, long, long before the dinosaurs, for that matter. And when I look at this picture, one of the things I notice, this is actually like a postcard that I purchased at that museum. You'll notice that it's missing one of its flippers. Its hind flipper is gone. It only has 3 flippers. And that's because they've determined it was actually bit off by a larger animal, maybe a shark. At that time, there were sharks that unfortunately are no longer with us, but could have at that time swallowed an elephant if they had existed whole, single bite. So that one got away with a hind flipper from this ancient turtle. So who knows what's out there and what did in fact live past the massive extinctions that did in the dinosaurs and a lot of the creatures in the ocean. Now, the game really changed in the 1930s when this gentleman, J.L.B. Smith, he's famous from South Africa. He discovered at a fish market someone who was selling this fish. And he recognized this. This is actually what we would think was a fossil fish. It actually was around in the days before creatures started living on land. They were marine animals, but this one actually was called a lobed fin fish. Interesting title, because its fins actually were developing into limbs. So it was able to actually kind of crawl onto the shore and crawl back into the water. And everyone had thought this thing had long, long, long ago gone extinct. So here he was with a living fossil. It made front page news in the 1930s. as a great discovery. At that time, it was a kind of a one-off find, but I used to work at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and in their collection of fishes, they had three of these creatures, these what are called coelacanth fish, lobed fin fishes. See, because as they started to know what to look for and where to look for them, they became more and more common. So our museum was kind of special for having three of them, but now there are dozens of these creatures in various science collections around the world. In fact, people have actually gone down in scuba gear to see living versions of these. It turns out these creatures go up and down. They're what are known as vertical migrators. They go up into the upper levels of the ocean uh, during daytime, and they move down into the deeper, darker parts of the ocean where it's really hard to see them. Fortunately, someone had a flashlight when they took this shot. So now that they know where to look for them in Indonesia, they're finding lots of these creatures. And no, they obviously did not go extinct. So they went from a possible cryptid to being confirmed as a real thing. Okay, now this is the one that I've kind of enjoyed. It's a hoax. These are deliberately crafted fakes that may have fooled somebody before the truth was revealed. Now, remember, we're primates. We basically like to monkey around and fool other primates with what we think are finds. And I bet if you really think about it, you're going to come up with a bunch of these fakes that are still around kind of for fun today. They're hoaxes. Yes, this is my personal favorite, the mysterious Montana jackalope. This is a postcard of this creature. You might, if you're traveling through Montana or Wyoming or that area, you might go into a truck stop and see a jackalope mounted on the wall with a head like a rabbit and antlers like a gazelle or some kind of a deer. So this thing has been made out of whimsy from spare parts, if you will, probably by taxidermists, but they've kind of become a tradition. If you're a good dive truck stop, you should have at least one of these to show people, yes, and sure they do exist. No, they don't. Okay, the other hoax I love is this one, Hickens fur-bearing trout, also from Clifford Lake. I think it's in Wyoming. This creature is totally fabricated by a taxidermist, probably has a rabbit fur glued to its body. And this fur-bearing trout does not exist, but sure keeps people entertained. I have to say, I'm proud to say that I have this postcard in my collection of weird stuff. And sometime, if you're lucky to get an invite to come to my home, you'll see that I have endless collection of weird stuff. That's my thing. Okay. I do want to point out that this famous photo of the Loch Ness Monster is a fake. It was created by a guy, it's a deathbed confession. Before he passed away, he admitted that this is a fake that he made by taking a remote controlled boat and putting a dinosaur-like head carved out of wood onto it. And it's hard to tell the scale of this, but it's much smaller than one would think. But it managed to fool people for a long, long time. So can't believe everything you see in photos, especially nowadays with AI. There's all sorts of tomfoolery going on. But it's always been a occupation, if you will, of faking people out with pictures like this. Now, ironically, if I really was interested in looking for unknown creatures on our planet, and this, by the way, is a photo from an illustration from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne's book written in the 1860s. That was all science fiction in Jules Verne's day. They did not have submarines that could go very deep, let alone go down into 20,000 league land. In fact, at that time, they believed that anything down by below 60 feet, as far as light could penetrate into the ocean, they said that was a lifeless zone. There were not plants there, there were not animals there, so it was a who knows what's going on. It is true that this giant squid that they write about in the book, in fact, almost eats the Nautilus, the submarine. They do exist. We didn't know that for a fact until quite recently. Prior to that, they would find pieces of these giant squid that might wash on shore after they died, or even more miraculous, that were in the stomachs of giant whales, like sperm whales, that would go down into the depths of the ocean hunting for giant squids. They would actually find eyeballs in the stomachs of these creatures during the days of whaling when they would catch these giant sperm whales and cut them open to get blubber and things like that, valuable products at that time. But the eyeballs that they were finding were about the size of a basketball today. They are actually the largest eyeball known to science. However, they did not actually have a photo or a film footage of a live one of these until the 1980s, when a Chinese crew, just by good fortune, stumbled upon some footage of these giant creatures, one of them in particular, swimming in the depths. So that was many years, 100 years of uncertainty there before they could actually go, yep, there it is. Amazing. But I would definitely be looking in the ocean. They say that the ocean, it covers something like 3/4 of our planet. We actually know more about outer space than we do about our own ocean spaces. And the idea of going down to great depths is something we can do with robotic submarines that actually go out and can take films and can actually either be manned or unmanned and get pictures of stuff we didn't know. We now know there are creatures that can live down in what are called undersea vents, deep, deep, deep ocean volcanoes. And there's a whole ecosystem of creatures that live around the what's flowing out of those undersea volcanoes. Kind of amazing. One of the most amazing stories about creatures we didn't know about is this one right here. This is a shark that no one knew existed. Kind of amazing. I'm going to turn the page here so I can remember my notes here. This creature is called a megamouth shark. Quite large. It actually was caught by accident by a Navy vessel that was stationed off of the Hawaiian Islands. And this was in 1976. Sorry, I had to look that one up. So a long time ago. The thing that's amazing about this creature is it's also a vertical migrator. It goes up and down in the ocean depths. And when it's spending most of its time down in the ocean depths, it's feeding on creatures that are attracted to daylight, kind of like the porch light on our front porch, how it attracts bugs. This creature actually has a glow in the dark mouth. Yay. So if you actually were watching this thing swimming around in the ocean, you would see kind of like a little flashlighty greenish light that emanated from this creature's mouth, would attract other creatures, and they, of course, the creature itself would swallow them. So Megamouth lived up to its name. There's actually one on display at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, preserved in formaldehyde. It's the only one I know that you can actually see on display. So yes, since they found that one, they are finding more of them because people know what to look for while they're catching them. Before that, they would probably, oftentimes, they would actually ditch these creatures because they didn't want to get fined for catching something that they didn't have a permit for. So commercial fishermen, it turns out, were coming across these more than we knew, but it was kind of a hush-hush thing for them. So there's plenty of discoveries just waiting for us as we get a little more serious about life in the ocean. Okay, this is an abrupt change here because now I'm going to talk about some of my favorite creatures, and a lot of these come from, uh, pardon me, from a gentleman named Paul LeBlanc. Paul passed away a couple of years ago. At the time I first discovered his work, he was working as a professor at the University of British Columbia, so on up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he studied ocean waves primarily. He was an oceanographer and a physicist by training, but what he really had another interest in was these alleged sea creatures. What are we going to say here? Not sea monsters, but we're going to say water beings that were being seen around British Columbia, and in particular off the coast of Vancouver Island. So he and another scientist pooled their resources. They put together uh, a survey that they distributed to as many people as they could. It was a questionnaire for people who thought they had seen something unusual that could not be explained away as, oh, it was a really big seal or, something that we thought we already knew. It turned out he got about 30 responses, and actually a few of them could be disproved or written off as missightings, but there were still, I think, 27 of them that could not be easily discounted. So he and his cohort, actually, this is in the days before everyone had computers. So they're using paper and pen to tally the results. And when they went through all those 27 undisputable results, or at least unexplainable, let's say, they divided that up on a sheet of paper, and they came up with the fact that there were three different kinds of these creatures being seen by people, mostly in British Columbia, but going all the way down to the Oregon coast and maybe in California. Any rate, here's what he wound up sending out as a report after they put this together. And again, because this is in the days before computers, this is all typed in by a stenographer. And it's also, I really like it because it plays really close to the chest in being good science, not making uh, unproven claims. Here's the paper. I know this is hard to see, but it says observations of large unidentified marine animals in British Columbia and adjacent waters. And this report was produced, I believe, in the, pardon me, I have to look at my notes here, in the 1960s. Oh, I'm sorry, 1973. That's the date it was published. I knew it was longer than I thought. Okay, so in 1973, in this, it also starts being a good piece of science. It's not making any really off-the-wall claims. And even in the foreword of this, it says, this report presents the results of a survey beginning in 1969 of sea monsters. That's in air quotes there. Displayed, discussed, and compared with previous published information on the subject. The fundamental question of existence remains unresolved. In other words, he's saying, I'm not saying they exist. I'm just saying people are saying this is what they saw. And also that this is based off of Hoovelman's categories. They are not useful for identifying our data, and doubt is thrown upon their validity. So he's kind of dissing other people's attempts at claiming and classifying cryptids, and he has his own version of how you would do that. He divided them up, like I said, into three basic types, and let's take a look at those. And at this point, no one has really advanced this whole survey any further. Looking at the ocean is a daunting task. There's a lot to see. If you've ever gone out on a whale watch, you can spend a lot of time looking out and not really discovering anything of value before you might have seen a spout or a fluke or a little evidence. But imagine trying to find a sea monster and not really knowing where to look or how to look. That was a challenge for all these people who came forward. They also are kind of well, they're in endangering themselves of being ridiculed for being having lost it, being ridiculous, unless they have better proof. So, with all that in mind, let's take a look at those three different types. Okay, these are glamorous titles. Titles. Type 1 has very large eyes, a horse-shaped head, a long neck, long by 5 to 10 feet, a body that shows 3 humps, covered with short fur, and is a fast swimmer. That's what most of these a portion of these witnesses describe this creature. Here's an illustration that is in that report put together by one of the eyewitnesses. It's not the most sophisticated drawing because the guy is not an artist here. He's just drawing what he sees. And this creature was seen by David Miller. He's a commercial fisherman, and he says that this thing was seen near Victoria in November 1959. You can see he's written in all the red eye, the strange mouth, kind of a furry body, coarse light brown hair, much like coconut fiber, it says, and a neck that stuck out 10 feet. Now, this person also said, Mr. Miller also said, as a commercial fisherman, I've seen all kinds of giant seals and things like that, but never anything like this, which seemed apparently to be kind of as curious in the fishermen as the fishermen were in this creature, but eventually it vanished from sight, never to be seen again. Moving on to type 2, similar to type 1, smaller eyes, a large floppy mane, and short giraffe-like horns. That came up in a percentage of these eyewitness descriptions. And here's the drawing that came from that. This is one that was drawn after a couple in the 1930s saw this creature off the coast of Yachats, Oregon. And they were actually, it was a New Year's Day. They were celebrating a wedding anniversary. They were out just staring at the ocean in an area called, I believe, the Devil's Punch Bowl. And they saw this thing swimming towards them. Fortunately, they were on a large bluff, so they didn't feel threatened by this creature. But most miraculously, they followed this creature with their eyes for a while till it started swimming out of sight. Then they hopped in their car and followed it along the highway there, Highway 1, I believe, and followed it for like half an hour until it eventually swam out of sight. And no one has seen this creature since, but it does look a lot like both the type number 1, with the exception of those horns and that hairy mane. If you remember the very first picture I had up on the screen, that was a more recent and more sophisticated painting of what this creature might have looked like. Some people call this creature Cadborosaurus because it's been seen off of the coast of Vancouver Island, off of Cadboro Bay. Someone just gave it that name, Cadborosaurus. Interesting animal. And supposedly there's over 200 different sightings of this creature throughout history, but no body to prove it and no really good photographs. So we don't know. Okay, next one. Type 3. This one is different from the previous two in that it's serpentine or snake-like in form, swims with loops of its bodies. It has a jagged fin along its back. And this is what I really think is fascinating. its head is sheep-like. Gee, what would that possibly be? Well, let's see if we can get some clue from the illustration done by the eyewitness. There we have it. This is the drawing, and not going to show you much, by Mrs. McLean. And Mrs. McLean actually lived in Harriet Bay off of Quadra Island. So she was on the water a lot with her boat, if nothing else, going out for grocery errands. And she saw this thing. You know, it's so funny to me because when we look at this picture, it almost looks like a sea cucumber or something. But this thing was quite large in length. And well, what could it be? It doesn't match up with any of the others, but there's been lots of history of finding these long serpentine creatures. And this one, for example, is actually from a British ship in the 1800s, where the entire crew reported seeing this thing. So did the captain, who wrote about it in the log of the ship. It's not something you would just tell a whopper. British sea captains did not do that. I'm sure they saw all sorts of unbelievable stuff, but when they saw this thing, they really had no explanation other than it was a previously undescribed water being. Okay, now this is the greatest suspect here. And I say that because if you look at the head, which is on the left side of this picture, you know, that does look kind of like a sheep. This is actually called an oarfish. These are gentlemen in Mexico posing with one that they caught and killed. So this is quite a large creature, and yes, it does exist. The thing that's ridiculous, though, is that this creature does not scientifically exist north of, say, Southern California. So the fact that someone saw one swimming around in British Columbia is kind of unlikelihood. I talked to the expert on oarfish who was explaining to me, no, that's probably not what they saw. But you know, there actually was an article that was in a popular science magazine about someone discovering one of these off of Whidbey Island a long time ago. And I was like, this must be proof. But in actuality, it also was found with a rope tied around its neck. Like maybe someone was trying to drag it back to their home. We don't know. But scientists will firmly deny the existence of this creature in our waters. So we don't really know what that creature was, but maybe we're just not seeing. You know, certainly the temperature of the oceans is changing. It's easier for creatures to make their way north during some certain times of the year. Maybe this is an anomaly that's just waiting for proof. We don't know. All right, now I want to just get into some random stuff here that's not in that report, but it certainly should be. One is that Canada has a 39-cent stamp devoted to a creature called Ogopogo. If any of you have been to Lake Okanagan up in Canada and British Columbia, not that far drive over the border of eastern Washington, there's a giant lake and there's a creature that people keep seeing that they call Ogopogo. I'm not sure if that's an actual name or just a nickname. It's not a Native American name or a Native First People name, but there it is, a postage stamp of what it looked like. It actually has all those traits, by the way. So I think someone had, before they put out the stamp in the 70s, they had read Paul LeBlanc's study, because sure enough, there's the red eyes and the horn and the mane maybe made out of seaweed. It's all in that stamp. In fact, every now and then, some people take pictures of what they claim are Ogopogo on Lake Okanagan, and people publish these, but hard to confirm what we're seeing here. Could be a log Could be rocks half submerged. We're not really sure, but it's a great tourist attraction, just like Loch Ness. So we don't know. I'd like to say that I saw this creature in Lake Okanagan because it does exist there. But in actuality, hold your horses. It's a statue that someone made and put into the lake as a tourist attraction for scuba divers. So people love to go there and get their photograph taken with that Ogopogo-like statue. But there is, at this point, no proof that this creature exists. Drat, I hate that. All right, now the real interesting thing for me, I started doing research on this topic for a book I'd like to write someday, but I haven't really gotten what I need to, other than rehashing old stories. I'd like to really get a story that's verified and verifiable. A lot of times, Native Americans have told me some interesting stories, and they don't have a lot to make fibs about. And the reason I'm showing you this picture is this is an area around Lake Chelan in Washington. And as you can see, this map is showing all these underground reservoirs. So it turns out that way, way before they started fiddling with the Columbia River and they put up dams and things like that, they kind of cut off the interplay of all of these underground reservoirs. And there's actually Native American stories that talk about how Coyote, the trickster character in a lot of the stories, actually drained all the small lakes into the Columbia River. And prior to that, it was easy for these underwater creatures, the lake monsters in this case, or aquatic cryptids, to actually go from one lake to another. And there's lots of stories, including as far north as Lake Okanagan, of creatures that may have gotten there from somewhere else. Kind of an interesting theory. And I'd really like to get some genuine verification that animals could travel from one of these reservoirs underground reservoirs into another lake. Interesting, but waiting to be proven. Okay, it's maybe through that way that people saw colossal Claude. Again, a lot of the same characteristics as those creatures we saw, the creatures that we saw in Paul LeBlanc's classic study, certainly the first one or two. And hard to say whether this creature, excuse me while I refresh it with a little water. It's hard to say if this creature is one of those guys from Vancouver Island, or whether, and that was actually able to enter into the Columbia River somehow, and actually was seen by a whole bunch of people. It says here, it was about 40 feet long. It had a neck 8 feet long and a big round body, a mean looking tail, and an evil, snaky look to its head. That was how it was described in an article in 1967 after this thing was seen right at the mouth of the Columbia River. So was that Cadborosaurus? Well, we don't really know. Interesting stuff, but definitely need of more study. Okay, the last thing I want to show you while I'm continuing to look at amazing stuff is a book by John Steinbeck. I hope you all know who John Steinbeck is. Certainly one of America's greatest authors, wrote lots of books that we know. And most recently, I read Travels with Charlie, which is about his traveling around America in the 1960s with his pet dog, Charlie. But, you know, The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men, and a lot of those other really good books. He also wrote a book that was called Log from the Sea of Cortez. And that's about him traveling around in Mexico, the Sea of Cortez, and going out on a ship with a famous naturalist, actually an oceanographer, uh, and learning as much as he could from this man, Doc Ricketts. Now, at one point in this book, he describes all these people are interested and they've just seen what they call the old man of the sea, who is a kind of a superstitious, unproven being. And John Steinbeck says in that part of the book that when they actually do find a sea monster, people are going to go, yep, there he was. I told you he was there all the time. It's kind of like mansplaining, if you will. But he maintains that a lot of people think this thing is there and they knew it was there all along. And he ends this little section, which I just love, with this part of the book where he says, men really need sea monsters in their personal oceans. An ocean without its unnamed monsters would be like a completely dreamless sleep. Man, I wish I could write like that. Sea of Cortez. Wonderful book and interesting on all sorts of levels if you choose to read it. I'm sure your library can get it for you. Okay, last but not least, I like this cartoon. It's from a British Columbian newspaper, and you can see that people are saying, look, look, to the right of Cadborosaurus, a coho salmon. So, you know, the way the world is changing, the way the ocean is changing, the way climate change is happening, or is it? Depends who you talk to. Things like the coho salmon are endangered of extinction, and things like Cadborosaurus, well, maybe they somehow figured a way of surviving all these mass extinctions and things like that. We just don't know. But to these guys on shore observing, it's more amazing to find a coho salmon than an actual Cadborosaurus. So leave them laughing is what I always say. That's pretty much what I have to share with you today. I'd like to open the floor up for questions from the audience, and I don't have access to that, so I'm hoping Robin will be our moderator here and read me some questions. Last but not least, let's go back to that nice painting that was done by a friend of Paul LeBlanc's a long time ago. Cadborosaurus. All right.
Thank you, David. So yeah, let's move into the Q&A. Moderators have been pulling questions from the chat during the program, and we're going to continue to do that throughout the Q&A. So keep your questions coming. Go ahead and pop them right into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So let's see what Robin has gathered for us. What kind of evidence is considered most credible when investigating cryptids like Bigfoot or Nessie?
Well, if we go, that's a good question. If we go all the way back to the 1700s, you basically had to have a living proof, what they call a type specimen, that all descriptions of this creature are based off of. Now, they don't have to be alive. And when I worked at the Natural History Museum in Chicago, I worked in the division of fishes. It was basically an enormous room full of glass bottles filled with preservative, formalin, and a dead fish. Actually, sometimes you could feel that because the museum itself was built on landfill on the shores of Lake Michigan, the landfill would shift a little bit, the whole room would vibrate a little bit, and you could hear all those glass bottles jingling. So the idea of having a type specimen, an actual physical specimen, dead or alive, would be really helpful. That's pretty much what did solve the puzzle of the okapi, for example, a live specimen. And same thing is true with the panda. But nowadays, we have such great documentation. It could be things like, in the case of Bigfoot, well-documented footprint casts, could be photographs, although seem to be, as far as clear and conclusive photographs, that's a rarity for sure. It's certainly a difficulty nowadays when people use cell phones and don't have the ability to zoom in on a picture. So really the thing is to have a number of proofs. Uh, Ideally, like I said, of course, maybe not ideal for the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot to have a dead specimen, but even bones, footprints, casts, or photographs, if they're all kind of combined together into one proof, would be helpful for establishing the existence of a cryptid.
How has media coverage influenced public belief in these creatures?
You know, that's a really good question. You guys are asking good questions tonight. You know what? I think public influence, and especially I would say the internet, has really changed the game a lot. There used to be, for example, Bigfoot gatherings, Sasquatch gatherings, where people would get together and exchange information and show pictures and maybe sell their books or what have you. Nowadays, you can more or less do that every day on the internet. So it's not a wait till next year when everyone gets together again. It's an ongoing thing. There are lots of databases where people can publish their eyewitness reports. So it's not nearly the trouble that it was during the Paul LeBlanc's day in chronicling the air quote sea monsters. And that's really spread things. Sometimes I wonder how things get popular overnight. Like all of a sudden, there's a creature known as the axolotl. It's a type of salamander that's become a focus for T-shirts and things like that. It's just kind of a creature hardly anyone knows, axolotl, but it's a weird animal, and all of a sudden it's super popular, probably because of the internet and sales through the internet. So hard to say. I would also say that right now, Bigfoot is probably, or Sasquatch, is probably at its all-time high in popularity. And man, if you go to the SeaTac airport and go to a gift shop, you're going to find all sorts of what I could call Sasquatch abilia, whether it's candies or T-shirts or air fresheners for your car, books, of course. I encourage you to pick up a copy of mine, whether you get it through the library or purchase your own. That all that stuff really seems to be a fad, but it seems to be increasing and not going away. I know when I was working on my book, the publishers were in a hurry, and this was 10 years ago, for me to finish it because they thought the craze might go away. And nowadays it's quadrupled in popularity. So go figure. It hasn't gone away at all. All right.
So we do have a comment from someone who says, I study oarfish quite a bit, and there's a subspecies of oarfish that lives up near Washington and British Columbia called the king of the salmon. It's another ribbon fish, and the Scripps Museum has a specimen found off Whidbey Island.
Well, there you have it. And that's the one I was referring to that was in a popular science magazine. But I would love to talk to anyone who has been studying oarfish or king of salmon for a career or a long time. So I would encourage you to contact me directly by email if you wouldn't mind. And that's easy, david@davidgeorgegordon.com. Because I'm still not satisfied with they don't exist up here. But that's what I was told by the gent who I forget his name, who actually wrote the book on oarfish. I also want to say, while we're familiar with seeing oarfish, like the way those guys were holding it in a long, you know, four different people holding this thing, actually, a lot of those fish are more likely to be seen, what would that be? Horizontally or vertically? No, they're up and down. They're actually hovering in the water, up and down, head to tail, and not like that. I guess that's horizontally. Is that correct? Any rate, they aren't seen the way we see them unless they're dead. And then they get posed that way, which makes them look more like these giant or like monsters. But
Right.
I'd love to talk to your expert here and learn a little more. So get in touch with me, please.
And Robin, my co-host, has just put your website URL in the chat. So
Oh, great.
anyone who wants to reach out to you, go ahead and click on that and you can contact David. Your email is definitely on there.
Yep.
So reach out. He'd love to hear from you. Have there been any recent sightings or investigations that stand out as particularly compelling?
There recent sightings, there have been interesting sightings like in 3 in 1 year about Lake Okanagan and Ogopogo. There have been at 1 year 3 sightings, and then the next year none. So those, and that's where that one photograph I showed of Ogopogo came from, that taken from a guy on his boat. Uh, but then there's whole years when there's nothing. And I know there's lots of serious studies going on to get to the probe the mystery of the Loch Ness Monster, and pretty serious science going into that, but has yet to really reveal anything extraordinary or conclusive. So I'd say the chase is still on in looking for these creatures.
Since the type 1 and type 2 Cadborosaurus are so similar, is it possible that it could be an example of sexual dimorphism?
Wow, I love this group. What a great question. That's quite possible. Sexual dimorphism, or males and females look differently. And that's true in marine mammals a lot. And a male stellar sea lion looks a lot different and is a lot bigger than a female, for example. So yes, it could be possible. It's unfortunate that we still have people who are looking into that original study, but there's not a lot of new stuff being published at this point. So actually, when I was encouraged to get into looking at this topic, I was encouraged by the fact that there still was more to be mined, like there is with the case of Sasquatch. But in actuality, I've come to the conclusion that some of the people who have the most conclusive sightings are First People, Native Americans. And that First People, the word Sasquatch came from Native Canadians. They have a very different take on what exists. In our world, in our non-native world, we have a lot of belief in the Garden of Eden and all those kind of Bible stories. That's kind of what we go way back on. Well, obviously, First People, Canadians or Native Americans in the United States don't necessarily have that same view. Some of them do, but they actually have a lot more of an open mind when it comes to so-called spirit animals. And that's where I'm finding some of the most interesting stuff. Unfortunately, the person who I talked with who was the most helpful has kind of vanished from sight. And this was all before and during the pandemic. So I'm really not sure where to go next.
Do you think any animal living today might become a mythical creature in the future or a cryptid?
Hmm. It seemed unlikely to me that it will go that way, but a lot of people in the days of the dinosaurs have all sorts of people who are interpreting a fossil life. Hypothetically, there are people that would maintain that Tyrannosaurus Rex does not look like the Tyrannosaurus Rex we would see in Jurassic Park, for example, but actually had feathered bodies covered with feathers. So they may have looked more like giant chickens for all we know. So I think there's a lot of misinterpretation of fossil evidence. But as far as things that people believe are out there, we really need some serious finds to put them into the new range. I will say that things that we thought were extinct, including things like the ivory-billed woodpecker, has now been seen in Cuba. So that's a creature that now is believed to be existing, but then was thought to be extinct. There was a Galapagos tortoise that was discovered on one of the islands in the Galapagos that was thought to be extinct up until about 5 years ago. And they found a live specimen. Before that, they had only found one dead female specimen. But yes, that thing still exists and has now been recognized to science, one of the Galapagos tortoises. So you just don't know. That's why I'm reticent to say that none of those so-called fakes are fakes, because someone could find them tomorrow and I'd be wrong. I just want better evidence.
Mhm.
Thank you for that question.
Someone would like to know if you are familiar with Old Greenie from Cayuga Lake in the Finger Lakes area of Western New York State.
Oh, no, I'm not familiar with Old Greenie. But there's lots of Lake Champlain has a lake monster. There are lots of them, and I guess even Lake Michigan. But I hope this person who asked that question will answer through comments or however you do that, what Old Greenie is.
Okay, yeah, tell us more in the chat if you know more about Old Greenie. And the very next question was about the water being in Lake Champlain, Vermont.
Well, yeah.
Real or hoax?
There's lots of stuff we don't know, and that's probably the thing that's fueling the interest in stuff like Bigfoot, is that we live in an era where we think we know everything, or at least our smartphones know everything. And in actuality, there are lots of things that just don't pencil out, and a lot of things that are theories that we really don't have solid proof on. We just have generally accepted theories. And by that, I'm thinking of the molecular theory, the atomic theory, and also, for that matter, genetics. A lot of genetics is a theory. We know things happen, but we can't really explain why. So that we like mysteries. We crave mystery. And I think that's really what's behind it all. And I
Mhm.
love mystery too.
Someone has a comment that the oarfish sounds a lot like a type 3 water being and is positing that the northern type 3s could be a subspecies or an undiscovered species of oarfish.
I would go with that. I'd like to find the answer of that one question, because I recall asking, I wish I could remember his name, the gentleman who wrote most recently a book about oarfish, if that was even remotely possible on Whidbey Island, and he said no. So I need to get back on it again. I was taken off the track of that whole. It takes me years to write a book because I like the research part is the most fun for me. And the pandemic meant I was not even going into Canada for 3 years. Now, of course, I could, and Nia Bay, the native Mackay Indian reservation was completely closed to outsiders. It really threw me off on this track. So it's time now to get back on it and figure out how to get better connections and better answers to these questions.
Are you aware of any protections in place for unknown species?
There are two protected statutes in Washington State, and one I believe is in Skamania County, where it's against the law to hunt or harm a Sasquatch. Those are the only actual legislations I know. I also have to say, I think it was Skamania County. I hope I got that right. The legislation was passed on April Fool's Day. So we don't know.
Appropriate.
Yeah, maybe. I'd like to resolve that one. That would be nice if during my lifetime someone could lay that one, confirm or deny it.
Okay, we have a few comments here. Someone says, regarding the possibility of lake monsters traveling through underground waterways, Flathead Lake in Montana has a history of lake monster sightings, and there's a Blackfoot legend that water horses live in the lake and travel to and from it via underground passages.
Wow, I like it.
That's very cool.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it's really interesting. One of the people I talked to, his father, no, I'm sorry, his grandfather was a tribal elder, a tribal chief, actually, in the Colville Confederated Tribes. And I saw this whole story written up in one of those classic tales of the early people, anthropology books, talking about how the coyote character did that whole thing of opening up the Columbia River and draining a lot of the lakes and access to the lakes. So that's actually been recorded as a verified or verifiable tribal story, and I think that's fascinating.
Another comment, in the 19th century, when people were hunting whales, the whales were described as monsters. So were sharks in the 20th century. And as we learned more, they weren't found to be so monstrous after all. And so sea beings seems to be a much better description. So I think that was appreciation for what you are referring to these sea cryptids as.
Well, sea monsters is definitely old school language, sailor talk. I would think if you were on a ship for months at a time, uh, malnourished and bored to death, that you would probably see all sorts of interesting stuff off the bow of the ship. In fact, my wife and I joke, I tease that she's a mermaid in that she'll do something amazing and then quickly disappear. So, and she's a painter for a living, by the way. But that was definitely the story for for sea folk, seafarers, to go look at that, and then it would disappear. So I think there's a lot of stories about people who believed in mermaids, including Christopher Columbus, but who did not actually see them.
Do you think the Tasmanian tiger still lives?
Oh, that's a good one. Man, we have the right audience for this talk. I really don't have a clue as to whether that one is true or false. What do you think?
Let us know in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Good question.
We do have some links to information about Old Greenie. I'm just checking those out. Ooh, one of them, I have a request timeout, but the other one I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat for anyone who's interested in reading more. And while I'm doing that, let's see. Someone else says, legend has it that upstate New York's picturesque Cayuga Lake is the home of not one, but two scaly 15 to 35-foot long serpentine beasts, one of which has a penchant for attacking humans.
Man, I got to look into that one. I think I've been focusing primarily on the Northwest, just simply because I had that great baseline story. But I know that there are lots of good stories of lake monsters, particularly amongst the Great Lakes.
Okay, this might be copy taken from that wiki. So I'm gonna go ahead and just put that in the chat, Old Greenie, so
Great.
that people can learn more. Okay, and just re-accessing the chat. Where did this question go? Have you heard of the ninth pangolin?
Is that the number nine?
Yes. Let
I've
us
heard
know if
of,
that's what you meant to type, but it says, have you heard of the ninth, number nine, th pangolin?
I know pangolins do exist because I've not seen the real thing, but I've seen video film footage of them. There are
Hmm.
documentaries about pangolins, but I don't know what the ninth pangolin refers to.
Okay. Let us know in the chat if you have more information about that or clarification. Um, and if you have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We have a few more minutes. We're sort of reaching the end of it, but we might have a few more sort of trickle in. I'm wondering if you know about that Sasquatch film that came out last year, Sasquatch Sunset.
Oh, I haven't seen that one. I've seen the title of it, but I stopped following that. It's really difficult. I get totally obsessed with a topic. Most recently, I wrote a book about oysters. So at that point, I was completely obsessed with oysters, and I kind of lose track of things for a little bit. But now I'm getting excited, and certainly from the reception of this particular audience, I'm enthusiastic about looking further into this whole topic and how to resolve it.
Someone else has a shout out for the film The Water Horse Legend of the Deep. And it looks like it is sort of loosely based on the Celtic water horse. So
I,
another cryptid movie.
I like it.
Okay, so someone would like to know if you wanted to get involved in researching cryptids, how would you go about doing that?
Well, unfortunately, the notion of just one stop shopping for cryptozoology is more difficult nowadays. That publication, the International Society of Cryptozoology newsletter, is not published anymore. And I really haven't seen anyone stand forth as a giant among cryptozoologists. There are a lot of Sasquatch hunters, and that seems to be where most of the energy is now. But I'm not seeing, aside from the Cryptozoology Museum that's in Maine, I'm not really seeing any authority on that. So I can't really give you good advice. I wish I had better leads myself.
There is a little bit of clarification about the pangolin. There
Oh,
are 8 known pangolins, and there's DNA evidence found among poached items, I guess, for a ninth pangolin. Interesting.
wow.
I had no idea.
Yeah, me neither. And if you haven't seen a pangolin or a photograph of one, they're pretty amazing creatures. They look prehistoric. So they'd be a great candidate for a, a cryptid in regardless, but they've definitely been documented as real.
Hmm.
That's great.
Okay, and someone else says the Center for Fortean Zoology is in the UK and is the most active cryptozoological organization currently. So that's one to check out if you're interested in learning more.
And they used to have a magazine called Fortean Times, which I haven't been following, so I'm not really sure if that still exists. But yeah, the Fortean Society is a good one. I think there's also a British Columbia, BC cryptozoology club that was originally going back to the days of Paul LeBlanc, but I think may still exist.
Great. Well, that is about all the time we have. So thank you so much, David, for your time and your interesting presentation. It was a pleasure.
Well, I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the caliber of the audience for this one. Thank you all so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for your questions and your engagement, everyone. So a big thank you to David. Thank you to everyone for listening to this presentation. And be sure to check the Sno-Isle Library's website for more online events, including digital collection basics and preservation on Wednesday, November 5th. Have a
Thanks.
great night all, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank
Bye,
you
everyone.
again. Have a good
Yeah,
evening.
thank you. Nice to see you. Bye.